The Rebel Capitalist Show.
So, John, what I'd like to ask you is how we push back. I don't think that this is inevitable, that 1984 turns into reality, or hopefully it's not inevitable. So looking back on history, what have people done to combat this type of censorship?
Well, if you look at the Soviet Union or the period of Germany between 33 and 45, you had brave individuals who would try and tell the truth. In the Soviet era, they had what's called if I'm pronouncing it correctly, samizdat, which were these publications that were in clandestine printing presses, were passed around. It was almost like the early Christians in Rome under Nero, sort of clandestinely sharing ideas with each other. You had a similar thing that happened in Central and Eastern Europe during the Soviet era. This is what we have to do. We have to start at the grassroots, talking with each other. First of all, getting everybody to understand what's going on. I mean, the first thing that we have to recognize is that propaganda is extremely effective. I mean, we've all heard of propaganda. We think, oh, that's just propaganda. That only happens in other places or only in wartime or something like that. But it's not true. Propaganda is constantly being broadcast, not only at the political level, but to get us to buy products. One of the great fathers of propaganda was Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, who started off working in the U.S. propaganda office during the First World War. And then he became probably the greatest Madison Avenue advertisement guy in history. And he wrote a book in 1929, or published it, called Propaganda, in which he meticulously dissects how does propaganda work. Now, he's actually advocating it, saying that propaganda is sort of unseen true government of society. It's not politicians standing on soapboxes. It's actually propaganda that is governing society. And he claimed in a salutary way. The first thing we need to do is recognize that we're all being exposed to propaganda, that it's representing certain interests, and that we need to learn to recognize it and to be skeptical of it. And once I think enough people recognize this isn't an accurate and unbiased representation of reality, it's a propagandistic representation serving certain interests. Yeah. The more that people recognize that, I think the more we can start to take measures against it. Now, if let's just say, for the sake of argument, God forbid that something like a totalitarian regime were to seize power in Washington, to invoke emergency authorities, the dictator's oldest trick. There's an emergency, there are bad people, there's insurgents, there's a viral illness. You have to surrender.
Like Trudeau and the truckers, basically.
Right. Then we have a big problem, because if you are able to seize that kind of power and command police and military units, we've got a big problem. I hope it doesn't come to that in this country, but and I don't want to be alarmist, but I think, let me put it this way to avoid trouble. If you study human history, all of it is characterized by occasional civil strife verging on civil war. And we had a civil war in this country between 1861 and 1865. I have several relatives who were in it, who they were literate people who kept documents and diaries. I know a lot about the Civil War, and it is ugly.
Right.
So we do not want to go there again. But I fear that if we don't have some more prudential, grown-up, civic-minded people who assume positions of responsibility, I feel like we're really cruising for a bruising in this country. I'm very alarmed based on my understanding of history.
Yeah, Peter, we discussed mass formation psychosis this weekend, and you thought that that may be contributing to what we're seeing today. And when you were saying that, I was thinking back to the 1970s and watching Milton Friedman and his series Free to Choose. I don't know if you guys remember that, but that's a series that he did, I believe, in the late 70s, early 80s on PBS, where he would make an assertion, do like a 45-minute video, and then they would have a debate between him and people that were like-minded, like Thomas Sowell, and then other people that were just straight socialists. And then this was on TV. This was on PBS, and they'd go back and forth in this debate. There was no sacred holy cow. They were just trying to figure out, and Friedman loved people who disagreed with him. And I remember, Donahue. You guys remember that show?
Yeah.
For the young viewers, that was the Oprah of the 1970s, Phil Donahue. And he would frequently have people on like Doug Casey, like Milton Friedman, like Ayn Rand, as an example. And he was a liberal. And I look at what's happening today and I ask myself, could this have happened in the 1970s or in the 1980s? Or could it just happen today or in a fourth turning because of this mass formation psychosis? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting how you're trying to apply it. Just one comment regarding breaking censorship. Under the current crisis, I think one of the great impediments is the inability to meet in groups in person.
Right.
And so we've actually been shifted to this reliance on remote communication through the computer or other forms of medium. And, for the first time during the crisis, I've been called into people's homes and going to home and to meet with 20 or 30 other people to ask me, what my opinions, have some interchange. I remember going to a home in San Diego and just meeting with other doctors to just discuss what's going on. So, I think there is a tremendous power to the in-person program. That's actually, we just had one together this weekend, and you saw the dynamics there. And I think there's no substitute for that. I'm greatly concerned. One of my colleagues in Germany has told me they cannot meet now in large groups in Germany. They are not actually allowed to do that. And you can see this. So once we're unable to meet in groups and even discuss things, there'll never be any interchange. Now, mass formation, the diagnostic clincher that clinches the diagnosis is absurdity. Where you see something absurd, then that's usually in this group dynamic context, it's mass formation. So what I mean here is Matthias Desmet, a professor of psychology at University of Ghent in Belgium, a tremendous, great book out, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. The English version is coming out very shortly. Has proposed that said, listen, there's 4 criteria. 1, we've had a prolonged period of isolation, right? So we can't get in meet. Number 2, we've had things taken away from us we used to enjoy doing. Number 3, constant free-floating anxiety through a whole variety of messaging and interactions. Then number 4, which is the capper, is that the solutions come from entities of authority, typically, government or an agency. And so we fulfilled mass formation. So anywhere you see absurdity, complete absurdity. One of the best examples has to do with, wearing various forms of facial protection. And there, someone swimming in a swimming pool with it on, or driving a car with it on. There's countless examples of absurdity. Spraying the sidewalk with decontamination spray. It's just
you're talking over the weekend. You're talking about people spraying their shoes in China right now.
Yeah, China, they're spraying their shoes. You'd say that's absurd. These types of things. So wherever you see absurdity, and there's medical absurdity. So if I did a medical intervention to prevent something, and then the patient got it, and then I did it again to prevent something, and the patient got it, and I did it again. And if I kept doing that if I gave a failed intervention over and over again to prevent something, and it didn't prevent the illness, that would be absurd. And so we're seeing now countless examples of absurdity. I'll tell you something else that's absurd is the idea that a single medical product can be taken by every human being on earth.
Yeah, panacea.
That's absurd. It's absurd. The human body is not that accepting. It doesn't work for blood pressure, for diabetes, cholesterol. Not every human body can take the same intervention.
Yeah.
I wonder, have either of you gentlemen ever seen the famous interview that the KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov gave to the John Birch Society in 1983?
No, what was that?
Oh, this is, I mean, it's like, you know, he might as well have been describing where we are right now. He was a high-ranking KGB counterintelligence guy, and he defected from the Soviet Union. He first went to Canada, but then he was let into the States, and he gave some interviews in the early 80s. Yuri Bezmenov, I highly recommend watching. Famous interview. And he said, it is a mistake to think that the KGB, the Soviet intelligence apparatus, he's a very funny guy too. He speaks English with great wit. He says, we all like to think of the intelligence service as the clandestine. It's daring do spies behind enemy lines. You know, James Bond, he says, you know, that sells a lot of deodorant and cologne, but the reality is that most intelligence work is what he calls, let me think for one moment, active measures. So what are active measures? Active measures, the primary method of doing this is penetrating the university system, the educational system of your enemy. In this case, it's Soviet fellow travelers in the United States penetrating our academic medical establishment. And then, as he describes it, pumping into the soft heads of the youth nonsense, a worldview that completely divorces the mind from any basic sensible conclusion about man, woman, life, death, my country versus some other country that's 7,000
We need
miles
censorship
away.
to preserve democracy.
This kind of thing. And oftentimes the slogans are expressed in ways that are perfectly contradictory. So Yuri Bezmenov said, you know, once you've got two generations of people who have not been educated in the art, the ability to perform basic deductive reasoning, to make basic distinctions, then you've destabilized the society. And it's not very far from that, between that and the collapse. He called this a process of demoralization, where this ultimately leads is that sensible grown-ups who are reasonable, who do understand the trade-offs of life, who do understand the distinctions and the hard choices that we have to make as reasonable grown-ups, they become very, very discouraged and demoralized and sort of give up.
Right.
And then the whole thing is turned over to very, very ruthless dictatorial people who, if there's any dissent left, they simply kill you. So, and this goes to one more thing I will add to this, and this is a much broader metaphysical thing that Peter and I discuss in our book. There's a chapter in our book in which he has a metaphysical conversation with his spiritual advisor, who says, you know, sometimes there are moments in history of where darkness is ascendant, where these primitive atavistic emotions in the hearts and minds of people, anger, resentment, irrationality, a desire to dominate, a lack of tolerance for dissent, but that becomes like a contagion, an ascendant thing. And Peter's advisor, you know, instructed him, that's what you're up against. You're one reasonable, scholarly, decent man who's up against an ascendancy of darkness. And so that's the story that I tell. I believe that's true. I believe we're in the midst of a spiritual battle. And Dr. is really been a heroic guy and climbing into the ring for all of us.
Yeah.